The village of St. Mildred's was the sort of place where nothing truly unexpected ever happened. Days drifted along at a comfortable pace, like the gentle stream that wound past the churchyard. The most exciting news in recent memory had been Mrs. Pritchard's tabby cat, giving birth to 7 kittens instead of the usual 4, the talk of the village that had been for nearly a week. It was early June when the vicar and his wife decided to hold their annual charity garden party. The rose garden behind the vicarage, lovingly tended by Mrs. Hardwick, was in its finest bloom. Pale blush climbers, deep crimson heritage roses, and yellow tea roses that smelled faintly of honey after rain. The event had always been considered one of St. Mildred's seasonal highlights, an occasion for ladies to wear their best hats, and for gentlemen to pretend they knew the difference between a damask rose and a floribunda. Miss Jane Marple had arrived precisely at 3:30, as was her habit, late enough to avoid the hectic opening chatter, but early enough to observe people when they believed no one was watching. She moved with gentle grace, her pale blue dress matching the sky, her white gloves spotless. She was greeted warmly, of course, though she never missed how people lowered their voices when she approached. Miss Marple had made a lifelong art of being underestimated. "Such lovely roses this year," Miss Marple remarked to Mrs. Hardwick, who immediately brightened with the pride of a woman whose roses had become her identity. "Oh, thank you, Miss Marple. The soil has been just right this season. Not too dry, not too damp," Mrs. Hardwick began, launching into a detailed explanation of rainfall and fertilizer ratios, which Miss Marple listened to with polite interest, though her eyes wandered gently over the rest of the guests. There was the vicar, Reverend Charles Albright, tall, gentle, and rather absent-minded. His wife, Margaret, brisk and efficient, made sure every teacup was filled and every guest was spoken to. Much fluttering about her. Nearby stood Mr. Leonard Finch, the village solicitor, speaking with Mrs. Selby, recently arrived from London. Rumor had it, under somewhat unfortunate circumstances, her husband, a businessman of some success, had chosen not to accompany her. That detail alone had fueled the tea tables for weeks. At the far side of the garden, near the old stone wall, stood a man who did not quite belong. He was young, no more than 30, with a serious expression and the sort of posture that suggested military background. Miss Marple watched him for a moment as he surveyed the garden with quiet intensity. Then he turned, catching her gaze for a fleeting second, before quickly looking away. Interesting, but the afternoon remained pleasant, the sunlight warm and the roses sweet, until the scream tore through the garden. It was Mrs. Hardwick. Her gloved hand flew to her mouth as she stumbled backward from the rose arch at the edge of the lawn. "Vicar Charles, come quickly. There's someone." Guests hurried forward, teacups abandoned, voices trembling. Miss Marple approached more slowly, her eyes attentive, noting every movement, every face, every gasp. Beneath the rose arch, half hidden in the shadow of crimson petals, lay a man. His body was slumped against the garden bench, his head tilted unnaturally to one side. The roses above him dripped petals like silent confetti, mockingly festive. He was quite dead. The young man Miss Marple had noticed earlier was already kneeling beside the body, 2 fingers pressed at the throat, though his expression made it clear he expected no pulse. The vicar, white-faced, whispered, "That's Arthur Llewellyn. I didn't know he was even in St. Mildred's." Miss Marple said nothing aloud, but quietly, in the soft recesses of her mind. Something clicked, not surprise, but recognition. The roses, the archway, the positioning of the body. Someone had wanted this death to look serene, as if it had been inevitable, as if it had grown right out of the garden itself. The breeze shifted, carrying the scent of roses and something far less delicate, something metallic, something final. Miss Marple folded her hands. "Oh dear," she whispered, "this will trouble the village terribly." And she was right. The whispering began before the body was even moved. At first, no one wished to say the word murder. It hovered in the air like the faint hum of bees among the roses, unspoken, yet unmistakable. The guests lingered in tight clusters along the garden path. Voices lowered to trembling whispers, eyes darting not toward the body now being discreetly covered with a picnic blanket, but toward one another. After all, in St. Mildred's, it was always easier to suspect a neighbor's secrets than to confront tragedy directly. The police had been sent for, and until their arrival the young man, who had not given his name, remained near the arch, silent and still, as though standing guard. Miss Marple took quiet notice of him again, the firm set of his jaw, the way his gaze rarely left the covered form. Protective or guilty? She did not jump to conclusions. Human behavior was all patterns, and patterns never revealed themselves in a single moment. Mrs. Hardwick had been led to a wrought-iron chair and given a cup of tea, which she could not manage to lift to her lips. Her eyes stared wide and unfocused across her immaculate garden, as if failing to comprehend how such ugliness could bloom among her roses. "It's dreadful, utterly dreadful," breathed Mrs. Selby, her voice trembling just enough to be noticed. "To die in a garden of all places, so peaceful until it isn't." Miss Marple turned to her with a mild, sympathetic look. "Yes, gardens are often full of surprises. One must be especially careful not to overlook the things that flourish quietly in the shade." Mrs. Selby blinked, unsure whether the remark held some hidden meaning. The vicar approached then, pale and strained. "Miss Marple, you knew Mr. Llewellyn, I believe?" "Oh, yes, though only in passing," Miss Marple replied softly. "He used to visit his aunt here some years ago, a charming woman, fond of embroidery, if I recall." The vicar nodded distractedly. Yes, that's right. But I had no idea he had returned to the village. He was rather troubled, I think." A ripple of curiosity moved through the nearby listeners. Troubled was a word that could mean so many things. Debt, disgrace, affairs, temptations. Each one more delicious to gossip about than the last. Miss Marple did not indulge the ripple. She simply let it pass. A short while later, the constable from the neighboring town arrived, young, earnest, and rather out of his depth. He spoke to the vicar, to Mrs. Hardwick, and then hesitated before approaching Miss Marple, as though sensing instinctively that she would be helpful. She told him only what she had observed, where Mr. Llewellyn had been found, how he had been positioned, the absence of struggle. The constable took notes with utmost seriousness, though his hand shook slightly. Meanwhile, the unknown young man at last stepped forward. "Lieutenant James Barton," he introduced himself quietly, "recently retired." He spoke more to the constable than to the crowd. "I examined the body before you arrived. There were no obvious wounds. However," he paused, "the scent of bitter almonds was present." A hush fell so quickly that even the bees seemed to fall silent. Miss Marple lowered her eyes, concealing the faint tightening of her expression. "Cyanide?" "So," Mrs. Selby whispered, her voice barely more than breath. "Then it was poison. But who would do such a thing?" Mrs. Hardwick gasped, finally finding her voice. "And in my garden, no one answered her, because everyone was suddenly wondering the same thing, each silently searching the faces around them. Miss Marple watched this shift. The subtle stiffening of posture, the guarded glances, the tightening of lips. Fear was settling in, but alongside it something else had sprouted, something darker. Suspicion. She understood then that this death would not simply trouble the village, it would divide it, just as roses grew best with careful pruning. The truth would require gentle, patient trimming away of every unnecessary leaf, every distracting bloom, and Miss Marple knew precisely where she would begin, not with the body, but with the emotion it stirred. Because in St. Mildred's, people rarely killed for convenience. They killed for reasons rooted much deeper, in old wounds, old grudges, old love. As the guests slowly dispersed, escorted gently toward the front gate by the vicar's wife and several flustered volunteers, Miss Marple remained in the rose garden, her hands folded neatly before her. The constable, who was doing his best to appear authoritative, looked relieved that the crowd was thinning. Crowds in small villages were far more dangerous than criminals. They had opinions. Lieutenant Barton lingered, too. He was standing once more near the rose arch, his gaze fixed not on the blanket-covered form, but on the ground a few inches away, where a few scattered petals lay crushed into the soil. His posture suggested a man who noticed things, though perhaps not in the same way Miss Marple did. She approached him quietly, her step light enough not to startle. "You recognized the scent very quickly," she said gently. "Not everyone would know it." Barton did not look up. "I spent time overseas assisting with certain investigations. Cyanide has a distinctive presence." He paused before adding, "But I doubt this was a crude poisoning. Whoever did this understood timing, setting, perhaps even sentiment." Miss Marple regarded him a moment longer. He was thoughtful, controlled, and carrying something private, a shadow behind the eyes. Many young men returned from war with such shadows. They did not always express themselves in words. "And you?" he asked, finally meeting her gaze. "You seem rather unsurprised by all this." "Oh, my dear," Miss Marple replied, with the faintest wistful smile. "Human nature rarely surprises me anymore. It simply repeats itself like patterns in lace." Before Barton could respond, the constable called awkwardly, "Miss Marple, Lieutenant, if you don't mind, I'll be needin' statements." They gave them, each measured, each calm. Miss Marple's was particularly brief, just observations, no interpretations. There was never need to reveal one's thoughts too early. People showed their truest selves in the days that followed tragedy, never on the day itself. The body was removed quietly through the side path, so the villagers in the lane would not see. But news in St. Mildred's did not require sight. Mrs. Pritchard's niece had already told the butcher's boy, who told his mother, who told Mrs. Selby's maid, who told everyone. By evening, even the parish hens would have heard that Arthur Llewellyn had returned to the village, only to die among roses. Miss Marple returned to her cottage on the lane, where the curtains fluttered gently in the evening breeze, and the scent of lavender drifted from her garden. She boiled water for tea, though she already knew she would drink very little of it. Her mind was too alive with quiet movement, thoughts weaving together like threads in tapestry. Arthur Llewellyn had been a charming young man once, charming in the careless way that could be mistaken for goodness. He had left the village years ago, shortly after his aunt passed, and rumor suggested his life after that had not been smooth. He returned now. Why? Not for the garden party. That much was certain. Someone in St. Mildred's had known he would be there. Someone had prepared. She sat in the small sitting room, hands resting lightly in her lap, and considered the cast of faces from the afternoon. Mrs. Selby, who watched other people too closely. Mr. Finch, who had stiffened when Arthur's name was spoken. The vicar, whose gentle face had held something like regret, and Mrs. Hardwick, poor Mrs. Hardwick, whose roses were her life, and who now would never walk among them without remembering the body in the arch. But fractured emotions were not clues. Miss Marple needed something smaller, something nearly invisible. She rose and walked into her own garden, where the evening light pooled gold on the soft petals of her climbing roses. She examined a leaf among the blooms, just as she had noticed one in the vicar's garden. There had been a faint dusting of white on several of Mrs. Hardwick's roses, not mildew, powder. A gardener would not allow something so careless, but someone placing something would not know the difference. Poison delivered by touch, perhaps, or disguised in scent. The roses had been chosen, not the tea. That changed the nature of the crime entirely. She stood very still. The motive was not convenience. It was personal. A quiet tapping sounded then. Someone at her gate. Miss Marple turned to see Mrs. Selby standing there, hands clasped tightly around her shawl, her expression breathless and urgent. "Miss Marple," she whispered, "I must speak to you. I remembered something about Arthur Llewellyn, and I'm afraid, terribly afraid, that people will think it was me." Miss Marple did not look surprised. She simply stepped aside to let her in, with the gentle nod of someone who already expected the knock, because guilt, real or imagined, always arrived before bedtime. Mrs. Selby stepped inside, as though crossing a threshold into confession. Miss Marple guided her toward the sitting room, where the tea tray still waited. The fire was unlit, yet the room did not feel cold. Miss Marple's presence had always been a sort of gentle warmth, one that encouraged truth to surface without force. Mrs. Selby sat on the edge of the chair, her hands twisting the silk of her shawl. "I did not expect to see him," she began, her voice low and strained. "Not after all these years. I thought he had gone, left everything behind." Miss Marple poured her a cup and set it beside her, though Mrs. Selby did not lift it. "You knew Arthur Llewellyn well," Miss Marple said softly. It was not a question, merely a space in which the truth could appear. Mrs. Selby's eyes glistened. Yes, before I married my husband. Arthur and I were close. Too close, perhaps. It was a long time ago. But when my parents objected, he changed, became distant, angry. He began drinking. I could not reach him. I married Edward Selby soon after. It was the sensible thing to do, the safe thing. She drew in a breath that hitched in her chest, and then Arthur left the village. I never heard from him again, until today. Miss Marple nodded, absorbing each word but revealing none of her conclusion. "Did your husband know?" she asked. Mrs. Selby shook her head. "Edward knows only what suits him to know, and what suits society to believe. If this becomes gossip, and it will, I shall be ruined. They will say I lured Arthur back, or argued with him, or—" Her voice wavered. "They will say anything that fits the most dramatic telling." Miss Marple reached forward and gently laid a hand atop hers. People often embellish the truth when the truth does not entertain them enough. Mrs. Selby's breath trembled in her throat. "I did not kill him. I did not even speak to him." Miss Marple believed her, not because of her tears nor the tremor in her voice, but because guilt, the true kind, made people quiet. Mrs. Selby was afraid of reputation, not of conscience. "Did you notice anyone else who seemed unsettled by his presence?" Miss Marple asked. Mrs. Selby hesitated only a moment. "Mr. Finch," she whispered. "The solicitor. When he heard Arthur's name, he froze. Only for a second, but I saw it. Like a man who recognizes a ghost he hoped would never return. This was useful. That sort of reaction was not sentimental. It was strategic. Mrs. Selby left soon after. Exhausted from her own confession, Miss Marple watched from her window as the woman made her way down the lane, shoulders drawn inward, as though trying to make herself smaller against the world's gaze. The evening deepened. Lights flickered on across the village. Shadows gathered around the hedgerows and stone walls, familiar shapes taking on unfamiliar weight. Miss Marple remained still for a long while, her thoughts circling not Mrs. Selby, nor Arthur himself, but Mr. Leonard Finch. A solicitor was a man who lived in paperwork and signatures, in estates and inheritances, in wills. Arthur Llewellyn's aunt had died some years ago. She had owned property, money, sentimental, heirlooms that did not quite match the value they were rumored to have. Miss Marple remembered something. Then, something small, something others would have dismissed. Mrs. Hardwick had mentioned, just last spring, that the old Llewellyn house had been due to change owners soon. She had been unhappy about newcomers. She liked things to stay in families, she'd said. So why had Arthur returned now? Had the sale not gone through, or had someone needed him gone for it to proceed? The answer, Miss Marple thought, would be found not in gossip, but in documents, and no one guarded documents more closely than Mr. Finch. But just as that thought settled, a sharp knock rattled her front door, urgent, uneven, almost frantic. Miss Marple rose calmly and opened it. Mrs. Hardwick stood there, her face chalk pale, her hands stained with something dark. I didn't know where else to go, she whispered. Miss Marple, someone has been in my garden. Her voice broke. And the rose arch, the one where he was found, it's been cut down. The words struck the quiet room like the crack of a branch. Miss Marple did not react with alarm, only a soft widening of the eyes, the smallest intake of breath. Mrs. Hardwick stood trembling on the threshold, her garden gloves smeared with dark soil and streaks of sap. Her whole body shook in a way that was not entirely grief. There was something like violation in it, as though something deeply personal had been defaced. "Come inside, dear," Miss Marple said gently, guiding her toward a chair near the window. "Take your time." But Mrs. Hardwick was in no state for tea or small comforts. The words tumbled out of her in uneven breaths. "It was the arch, the climbing rose I've tended for 12 years. I went to water the garden just now, hoping the quiet of it might calm me. But when I reached the back, the arch had been hacked through. Not pruned, no gardener would cut like that. It was—" She broke off, her hand flying to her mouth again. "It was destroyed." Miss Marple listened without interrupting, though her mind moved quickly beneath her calm expression. Someone had returned to the scene, not to mourn, not to look, to remove. "To erase something. What did you do then?" she asked softly. "I ran straight here," Mrs. Hardwick whispered. "I didn't want to call the police before speaking to someone who sees more clearly. I felt you would understand that this wasn't ordinary vandalism." "No," Miss Marple agreed, her voice as steady as ever. "It wasn't." The rose arch had been the frame around the body. The position of Arthur Llewellyn beneath it had not been random. It had been meaningful. Removing the arch was like tearing a page from a book that someone wished others not to read. It happened only after the villagers left the green and night set in. Miss Marple murmured, thinking aloud. Someone waited for darkness. Someone who feared what that spot might reveal. Mrs. Hardwick nodded helplessly. But what could the arch show? Miss Marple did not answer directly. "Not yet. Did you see anyone near your garden this evening? Hear footsteps? A gate?" she asked. Mrs. Hardwick shook her head. "No, but I did hear something earlier. A voice, or perhaps two, but I thought it was just people passing by after supper." Everyone has been gathered outside, discussing the tragedy. Miss Marple did not correct the use of the word discussing. It was gossip, of course, but calling gossip by its proper name rarely helped anyone. She stood. "I think we should go to your garden," she said simply. Mrs. Hardwick paled. "At night?" "Yes," Miss Marple replied, as though it were the most natural thing in the world. Some things are easier to see when people believe themselves unseen. They walked together through the quiet village lanes, lamplight spilling across cobblestones. A few curtains twitched as they passed, anxious watchers peering out. But no one stepped outside. St. Mildred's had folded itself into tight, whispering pockets of speculation. When they reached the vicarage garden gate, the night air was heavy with rose scent. Sweet, but cloying now, almost suffocating. Mrs. Hardwick's breath hitched again when she saw it, where the arch had stood. A graceful structure of iron and bloom. There was now only the rough stubble of severed stems, petals strewn across the grass, like remnants of some private ceremony. Miss Marple knelt, her gaze sweeping the ground not for what was missing, but for what had been left behind. There were footprints in the soil, not deep, light, careful. Someone who knew how to move quietly, but something else caught her attention. A few rose petals further from the rest, crushed and smeared with a faint sticky residue. Miss Marple touched the ground lightly with her gloved fingertips. Not sap, not dew, a powder, pale, very fine, the same dust she had noticed that afternoon. So the poison had not been in a drink or food. It had been on the roses. Someone had prepared the arch for Arthur specifically, but the roses had not been cut down to hide the poison. They had been cut to hide something else. A small glimmer of metal caught the moonlight among the fallen petals. Miss Marple reached for it, carefully lifting it from the ground. A cufflink, silver, engraved with initials. She held it up just enough for Mrs. Hardwick to see. Mrs. Hardwick gasped. "Leonard Finch, the solicitor." Miss Marple closed her hand around the cufflink, her expression unreadable. "It seems," she said softly, "that Mr. Finch has a great deal to explain." Mrs. Hardwick stood frozen, staring at the glinting cufflink as though it were an omen. Miss Marple, however, merely turned it in her fingers, studying the engraving under the moonlight. The silver had dulled slightly with age, but the initials were clear. LF. The etching was sharp, deliberate, almost prideful. A man like Leonard Finch, she thought, would not lose such an object carelessly. Not in a garden, not in the dark. Best to leave the rest untouched. Miss Marple murmured, wrapping the cufflink delicately in her handkerchief. Sometimes a single forgotten thing tells the truth far more loudly than a confession. Mrs. Hardwick's breath came uneven. Do you think he killed him?" Miss Marple didn't answer immediately. "I think," she said at last, "that Mr. Finch has been rather anxious to seem uninvolved. And people who strive too hard to appear calm usually have something they fear others will notice." They left the garden as silently as they had come. Miss Marple locked the gate behind them, the soft click of the latch echoing faintly in the still night air. The moon cast long shadows across the vicarage lawn, stretching thin and uneasy, as though the garden itself were remembering. When they reached the lane, Miss Marple insisted on walking Mrs. Hardwick home before returning to her own cottage. The poor woman's composure was nearly gone, and though she protested faintly, the comfort of companionship outweighed pride. Miss Marple listened quietly as Mrs. Hardwick spoke in low, frightened bursts about how the village would never feel safe again, about how she feared her reputation would wilt like her roses. But Miss Marple's mind was already somewhere else. Finch's cufflink had not been there by chance, nor had his reaction earlier, That tiny flash of alarm when Arthur's name was spoken. There was a story binding those two men, and she intended to pull out its threads until it unraveled completely. The next morning brought a soft drizzle, the kind that made the village look like an old watercolor, blurred edges and muted tones. Miss Marple rose early, as she always did, and went about her morning as though it were any other day. Only when her kettle began to hum did she glance toward the handkerchief resting on her table, the silver cufflink now dry and cold. A knock at the door came precisely at 9:30. It was the constable, looking more uncertain than authoritative. "Morning, Miss Marple. Thought I'd best let you know the inspector from Downsfield's come. They'll be calling on everyone who was at the vicarage." "How very thorough of them," Miss Marple said mildly. "Do convey my best regards." She waited until the constable had gone before setting out herself, umbrella in hand. The drizzle had eased into mist by the time she reached Mr. Finch's office on the corner of the High Street. It was a tidy little building, with polished brass lettering on the door and curtains drawn a little too tightly. Inside, a clerk with a nervous expression informed her that Mr. Finch was in conference. Miss Marple merely smiled. "Do tell him," she said sweetly, "that Miss Marple wishes to discuss an item of his that was found in a rather distressing location." She did not have to wait long. Within moments, Leonard Finch appeared, his usual composure slightly fractured. He gestured her into his office with the politeness of a man who wishes to conceal unease. "Miss Marple," he said, forcing a thin smile. "What a surprise. I suppose this is about the dreadful business at the vicarage." "In a way," she replied, taking the chair opposite his desk. "I happened to be in Mrs. Hardwick's garden late last night. We found something that, quite unfortunately, belongs to you." She opened her handkerchief and placed the cufflink gently on the desk. Finch's reaction was small, too small. His fingers froze just before touching it, then withdrew. "Ah," he said, after a pause too long to be natural. "I must have dropped it when I was speaking with Mrs. Hardwick earlier that day. We discussed a few legal documents of hers, you see." "How fortunate," Miss Marple murmured, "that you chose to conduct business near the Rose Arch." His eyes flickered. Well, it was a warm day, and she preferred to meet outside." "Yes," said Miss Marple, her tone as mild as ever. "Warm days make people careless. They lose things, words, even alibis." The silence that followed was delicate and dangerous. Finch stared at her, weighing what she might know. Miss Marple, meanwhile, smiled, as if discussing the weather. "I do wonder, though," she continued softly, "why a man of your precision would risk his reputation on something so easily traced. A monogram, for instance, tells such personal stories." Finch's lips tightened. "Are you accusing me of something, Miss Marple?" "Oh, heavens, no," she said cheerfully. "I'm merely remarking on how objects have an inconvenient way of finding their way home. Much like people, wouldn't you agree?" He looked away, and in that tiny movement, barely perceptible, Miss Marple saw the truth of it. Not guilt, not yet, but fear. Fear that someone might uncover what he had hoped was buried, along with Arthur Llewellyn. She stood, smoothing her gloves. "You'll forgive me for intruding, Mr. Finch. I know the police will have their questions soon enough, but sometimes it helps to be reminded that honesty, however late, is cheaper than concealment." And with that, she left him there, staring at the silver cufflink as if it had begun to burn through his desk. Outside, the mist had thickened into a fine fog. Miss Marple walked slowly back toward the lane, her umbrella glistening with droplets. She had no need to hurry. Secrets in St. Mildred's were like seeds. Once disturbed, they always sprouted sooner than anyone expected. And somewhere, she was quite certain, another seed was already breaking through the soil. Miss Marple continued along the high street, her steps steady and unhurried. To an onlooker, she appeared simply an elderly lady taking the morning air. But inside her mind, threads were tightening, weaving together into shape. Leonard Finch's reaction had not been that of a guilty man, nor of an innocent one. It was the reaction of someone trapped between what he knew and what he feared would now come to light. Fear was rarely about the crime itself. More often it came from something connected to it, something older, rooted deeper. As she reached her gate, she noticed Lieutenant Barton waiting by the stone wall, hands in his coat pockets. The mist beaded against his hair and the shoulders of his jacket. He looked as though he had been standing there some time. "You are at Finch's office," he said gently, not accusingly. "Yes," Miss Marple replied, opening the gate. "Would you like to come in for tea, Lieutenant? It is always best to talk while one's hands have something to do." He hesitated, then followed her in. Inside, the cottage was warm and faintly scented, with lavender polish and rose hip jam. Miss Marple prepared 2 cups, one strong, one mild, and handed him the stronger without asking. He accepted it with a slight flicker of appreciation. The kind of man, she thought, who had learned to measure people quickly. "I spoke with the inspector this morning," Barton began. "He's convinced the death was intentional, likely poison, but he thinks we should look for someone with access to chemicals, garden supplies, tinctures, perhaps Mrs. Hardwick herself." Miss Marple stirred her tea. A tidy thought. Too tidy, in fact. Solutions that present themselves immediately are rarely the true ones. Barton let out a slow breath. "You think it was personal?" "Oh, undoubtedly," she said softly. "Murder usually is, despite popular belief. Theft and war are general. Poison is particular." He looked at her then, not simply as a kindly elder, but as someone seeing further than the constable, the inspector, perhaps even himself. "Mr. Finch," he said, leaning forward. "Is he involved?" "Involved, yes," Miss Marple replied. "Responsible, not yet proven." She opened a small notebook, neatly kept, almost innocuous, and pointed to 3 lines. "Arthur returns. Estate unsettled. Finch, anxious. What ties Arthur Llewellyn to the solicitor is not affection," she continued, "but paperwork. And paperwork, I've found, often conceals unpleasant histories. Altered wills, unsigned deeds, inheritance disputes." Barton nodded slowly. "So the motive could be financial." "Financial motives often wear the mask of something nobler," Miss Marple said. "Duty to a family, protection of reputation, even love." The last word hung in the air. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Barton said quietly, "There's something else. Arthur was seen at the post office the morning of his death. He sent a letter. Urgent post." Miss Marple stilled. "To whom?" "We don't know. The postmistress remembers only that the envelope was addressed to someone in St. Mildred's." Something inside Miss Marple clicked, not loudly, but cleanly, like a lock sliding into place. A letter arriving after the sender's death could be either confession or threat. "Lieutenant," she said, already rising, "we must go to the post office at once. If that letter is collected before we see it, we may lose the key to everything." Barton stood immediately, his chair sliding back. They stepped out into the mist again, walking briskly now. The village green lay ahead, quiet, glistening, holding its breath. But as they approached the post office, they saw someone already emerging from the door, Mrs. Selby. Her eyes were wide, not with shock, but with recognition. She held a letter in her hand. The envelope was still sealed, and the name written across the front was hers. Mrs. Selby froze when she saw them approaching. Her fingers tightened around the envelope until the paper bent slightly at the edges. She did not speak, perhaps could not. The mist clung to her hair and lashes, making her appear almost ghostly, as though she were some figure conjured from memory, rather than flesh and breath. Miss Marple, however, stepped forward with the gentle composure of someone greeting an old friend in church. "My dear," she said softly, "you've received the letter." Mrs. Selby swallowed. Her voice emerged, barely audible. "I didn't know he had written to me. I didn't know he was coming back. Miss Marple placed a hand on her arm, not to restrain, only to steady. Barton watched closely, but he did not interrupt. "You needn't speak on the street," Miss Marple murmured. "Let us go somewhere quiet." Mrs. Selby nodded, though her steps felt slow and uncertain. They walked together to Miss Marple's cottage. Barton followed a few paces behind, aware that truth often unraveled best in calm rooms. Inside, the air was warm again. Mrs. Selby sat where she had the night before, yet she looked entirely different now, no longer fearful of gossip, but of truth. Her hands trembled as she held the unbroken seal. "You may read it when you are ready," Miss Marple said, "or I can read it aloud if that would be easier." Mrs. Selby shook her head. "No, I must do it." She drew a breath and opened the envelope. The paper inside was a single sheet, folded twice. She unfolded it carefully, as though afraid it might tear under her fingers, and began to read. Her eyes moved slowly at first, then faster, then halted. Whatever color she had left drained entirely from her face. She lowered the letter, but did not speak. Miss Marple waited. She had learned long ago that sometimes silence was the only invitation courage needed. At last Mrs. Selby whispered, "He wanted to meet. He said he had discovered something to do with his aunt's will. He said the original document was changed." Barton leaned forward slightly. "Changed? By whom?" Mrs. Selby's voice broke. "He believed Edward, my husband, was involved. He thought Edward and Leonard Finch altered the will together. He meant to confront them." The room grew quiet and very still. Miss Marple's eyes softened with a kind of sad comprehension. "Yes," she said quietly, "I suspected something of that nature." Mrs. Selby looked up, startled and wounded all at once. "You suspected Edward? You think my husband, killed Arthur?" Miss Marple didn't answer immediately. She chose her words with care. "I think," she said, "that your husband had more to lose than most. A man who has built his life upon reputation cannot afford scandal. And Arthur Llewellyn's return did not threaten simply money. It threatened pride." Mrs. Selby's hands clenched around the letter, but she did not deny it. Her stillness was the stillness of realization, not surprise. "But," Barton interjected, frowning, "the cufflink belonged to Finch, not Selby." Miss Marple nodded. "Oh, yes. Finch was present in that garden last night. Quite certain of it. But the question is why." She looked at Mrs. Selby, gently, but not without intent. "Did Finch care for Arthur, or your husband, or you?" Mrs. Selby's eyes flickered, just once. Miss Marple saw it. There it was. Not love. No. Something more complicated. Loyalty, debt, obligation. "Mrs. Selby," Miss Marple continued softly, "was Mr. Finch trying to protect your husband?" The silence answered before Mrs. Selby did. "Yes," she whispered. "Leonard has always handled Edward's business affairs, and Edward relies on him. Far more than he would ever admit. If Arthur confronted Edward, if the matter became known, it would destroy him. And so," Miss Marple said, her voice low and calm, "someone decided Arthur must not speak." Mrs. Selby closed her eyes as tears slid silently down her cheeks. But Edward would never have done such a thing. She whispered, "He's proud, yes, but he is not cruel." Miss Marple leaned forward, her tone quiet but unyielding. People are rarely cruel until something they value is threatened. The question now is whether your husband acted alone, or whether Leonard Finch acted for him. Lieutenant Barton stood very still, absorbing that. Mrs. Selby's hands trembled around the letter, and Miss Marple, watching her carefully, saw the moment the next realization formed in the woman's face, clear, sharp, devastating. Her voice was barely breath. "My husband wasn't at home last night. He told me he was working late at the office." Miss Marple nodded once, slowly. "And you believed him," she said kindly, "because you wanted to." Mrs. Selby shook, but she did not collapse. There was strength in her, buried but present. Miss Marple reached for her coat and gloves. "It is time," she said, "that we speak with Mr. Selby. Not to accuse. Not yet, but to watch him. Because people reveal themselves most clearly when they believe they are still hidden." They walked together toward the Selby residence. Miss Marple, Lieutenant Barton, and Mrs. Selby moving like three figures, drawn toward a truth none of them fully wished to face. The mist had lifted now, replaced by a brittle clarity in the air, the kind that follows rain and makes every sound feel sharper. The Selby house stood with its neat hedges and polished brass knocker, a place that prided itself on appearances. Miss Marple paused before the door, not from hesitation but to allow the moment to settle. These small pauses often revealed more than words. Mrs. Selby opened the door herself with her own key, though her hands shook. Inside, the house smelled faintly of varnished wood and lemon oil. A clock ticked somewhere deeper in the hall, steady and unhurried. Life inside continued, as though death had not brushed so closely against it. Edward Selby was in his study. They found him sitting behind his desk, spectacles low on his nose, pen in hand, as though reviewing accounts. He looked up when the door opened, irritation flashing briefly across his face, then replaced by the expected polite concern reserved for company. "My dear," he said, rising, "I wasn't expecting—" His words halted as he noticed Lieutenant Barton and then Miss Marple. His posture did not stiffen. Rather, it settled, like a man preparing himself for the conversation he had feared might come. "Mr. Selby," Miss Marple said gently, "forgive the intrusion. We wish to speak with you regarding Arthur Llewellyn." The name struck him like a thrown stone. Not visibly, but the stillness that followed was too precise to be natural. A breath held too long. A blink delayed. "Unfortunate business," he said finally, voice carefully controlled. "A sad end for him, though I admit I hadn't expected him here. Not after all these years." Miss Marple observed his hands, steady, unshaken, resting loosely against the edge of the desk. A practiced calm. "You knew he had returned," she said mildly. "He sent your wife a letter. It reached her this morning." His gaze flicked to the folded paper in her hand, just once. And that single glance told Miss Marple he already knew its contents. Mrs. Selby stepped forward, voice fragile but determined. "Edward, Arthur believed you and Leonard Finch altered his aunt's will." Selby did not speak. His face did not collapse nor harden. He simply drew in a slow breath and set his glasses down. "You believe him?" he asked her, not with anger, but with something far more painful, disappointment. Mrs. Selby lowered her eyes. Miss Marple stepped softly between them, not physically, but in tone. Truth is rarely neat, Mr. Selby. Sometimes it becomes tangled with necessity, but tangles are only knots tied by hands, and they can be undone. Selby's composure slipped, just a fraction. His jaw tightened. "I did not poison Arthur Llewellyn," he said, "if that is what you have come to imply." "No," Miss Marple answered gently. "I do not believe you did." Mrs. Selby looked up sharply. "Then who?" Miss Marple turned her gaze toward the window, where the Selby garden lay quiet and trimmed, every hedge symmetrical. "The murderer," she said, "was someone who knew Arthur would walk directly beneath the rose arch, someone who knew where he stood and how he stood." Selby's eyes widened, not at the words, but at the realization forming behind them. Miss Marple continued, her voice soft as thread. "Arthur was the sort of man who always leaned back when speaking, arms relaxed, shoulders loose. It is a posture learned from someone he trusted, a habit shared, not taught." She faced Edward Selby fully. Whom did Arthur learn it from? The silence that followed was different from the others. It was a silence of recognition. Slowly, painfully, Selby's eyes closed. "My son," he whispered. Mrs. Selby's breath caught. Barton went still. Miss Marple nodded. "Yes, the boy, William Hardwick, Mrs. Hardwick's nephew. The young man raised in her cottage after his parents died. The quiet one, the one who moved with careful steps, the one who knelt beside Arthur's body faster than anyone else." Lieutenant Barton inhaled sharply. The lieutenant, James Barton, was mistaken, Miss Marple said softly. The young soldier at the garden party was not a stranger. It was William Hardwick who accompanied him earlier to town, and William was there before anyone realized Arthur was dead. Mrs. Selby pressed a hand to her mouth. William, Miss Marple continued, had grown up believing his family's misfortune was the result of others' greed. He cherished Mrs. Hardwick's roses because she cherished them, and he despised Arthur Llewellyn for what happened after the aunt's estate was contested. Her voice gentled. The boy killed Arthur for old wounds, for loyalty, for love. Not romantic love, but the fierce protective love of a child defending the only family he believed he had left. Selby exhaled, slow, hollow, and somewhere in the village, Miss Marple knew a young man was likely preparing to run, not because he feared punishment, but because he feared being seen. Miss Marple picked up her coat. Once more. "There is just one thing left to do," she said softly, and they all understood. It was time to return to the rose garden. The three of them, Miss Marple, Lieutenant Barton, and Edward Selby, walked back toward the vicarage garden in a silence that was not empty, but heavy, layered with understanding that had finally taken shape. The path felt different now, though it was the same stones underfoot. It is always that way, Miss Marple thought. When truth begins to rise, familiar places shift their meaning. Mrs. Hardwick was already in the garden when they arrived, kneeling by the ruins of her rose arch. Her hands rested in her lap now, still stained from the night before, but her expression was strangely calm. She did not startle at their approach. She seemed to have expected it. Miss Marple crouched down beside her, not close enough to intrude, but close enough to offer presence. "He's gone, isn't he?" Mrs. Hardwick said quietly. Barton stepped forward, unsettled. "Mrs. Hardwick, where is William?" Mrs. Hardwick didn't cry. She didn't tremble. She simply looked tired, in a way that went deeper than years. Packed a small case, and left before dawn. Said he needed air. Said he might walk to the train stop in Downsfield. I knew the moment I saw the empty wardrobe that he wouldn't be coming back. Selby exhaled softly. Barton turned toward the gate, ready to move, but Miss Marple raised a hand. "Let him be," she said, her voice steady. "Running is not always guilt. Sometimes it is grief that has nowhere else to go." Barton hesitated. "But he killed a man?" Miss Marple nodded. "Yes, and he will be found. But if we chase him now, he will run harder, and frightened hearts make desperate decisions." Mrs. Hardwick's voice was a whisper, scraping through tears that would not fall. "He thought Arthur ruined us. When my sister and her husband died, the boy was lost. Arthur said the estate needed to be divided, that some of the property had been mismanaged. It wasn't untrue, just badly timed," Edward Selby argued. "Finch managed the papers, but the boy, William believed Arthur had taken something from us, that our loss had begun with him." Miss Marple laid a hand gently over hers. "Grief often chooses a face to blame. When the truth is too shapeless to hold." Mrs. Hardwick looked at her roses, the roses that had always meant peace, patience, and devotion, and said, "William grew up among these. He knew every thorn, every bloom. He grew into silence, not violence. I don't know how it came to this." Miss Marple's reply was soft. "He did not kill out of hatred. He killed because memory can twist love when pain is left untouched." Selby closed his eyes. Barton exhaled, the tension shifting into something slower, heavier, not yet resolved. Miss Marple's gaze moved across the garden, not searching, but seeing. "The poison was not complicated," she said, almost to herself. "It was brushed onto the rose petals at the arch. Arthur was meant to brush against them, just as he had when he and William were young. They used to sit beneath this very arch, didn't they?" Mrs. Hardwick nodded. "He used to ruffle William's hair, lean back just so." "Yes," Miss Marple murmured. "Patterns of affection do not fade. William counted on that." Barton looked toward the path. "We should go after him." "You will," Miss Marple said softly, "but not with urgency, not with armed men and raised voices. He will come quietly if he is spoken to as William, the boy who loved roses, not as a criminal cornered." Selby, pale and silent, finally found his voice. "I can go," he said. "He won't run from me." Miss Marple studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Yes, because though your past actions played a part, it is William who must choose to face what he has done. And he will. He has not destroyed the roses entirely, only the arch. That was grief, not malice." There was a long silence among them, the garden holding its breath. Mrs. Hardwick finally whispered, "Will he be punished?" Miss Marple looked at the crushed petals, the empty space, the memory of two boys once laughing beneath an arch now gone. "In law, yes," she said, "but in life, punishment has already begun." And then very gently, as though sealing the moment, "People sometimes imagine murder begins with anger, but more often it begins with sorrow." The roses bowed in the breeze, as though acknowledging the truth. The garden would grow again, but it would never be quite the same. And in St. Mildred's, life would go on, quietly, watchfully, carrying with it the memory of the boy who loved the roses too fiercely to let them go. A gentle breeze rustled the garden leaves as they stood there, each absorbed in their own thoughts. No one hurried to leave. The truth, once spoken, has a way of slowing time rather than speeding it. Mrs. Hardwick rose to her feet first. She brushed soil from her skirts, though her movements were absent, as if her hands were acting without her mind's direction. "I should make tea," she murmured. There should be tea. It was something familiar to hold on to, habit as comfort. Miss Marple nodded, and Mrs. Hardwick slipped quietly toward the house, her steps small and deliberate. Edward Selby remained at the edge of the grass. The man had always been attentive to posture, to presence, but his shoulders now sagged under the weight of memory and consequence. He stared toward the lane where William had gone, and his expression was not one of anger, nor even shame. It was the expression of someone who has seen, all at once, how every decision he had made, even respectable, even well-intentioned, had led to a place he never intended. Miss Marple approached him gently. "You cared for the boy," she said. Not a question. Selby drew a long breath. "His mother was my cousin. When she and her husband died, I handled their affairs. William came here on weekends. He was quiet, observant, sensitive. I saw myself in him, I suppose." His voice tightened. "But the business with the aunt's estate, it was complicated. It always is. Finch advised I assert a claim. We believed we were protecting family interests. I did not consider how it might appear to others, or what the boy might hear or believe." "Children," Miss Marple said softly, "are often witnesses to more than adults think, and they make meaning of it in their own ways." Selby nodded, eyes distant. "He thought Arthur took something from us, but it was I—" He stopped. The word fault hovered, but he did not speak it aloud. Miss Marple placed a gentle hand on his arm. "Understanding has come. That is not forgiveness nor absolution, but it is a beginning." Barton cleared his throat, though carefully. "I'll go to Downsfield Station, quietly. If I find him, I'll speak to him. I won't call anyone in until I must." Miss Marple gave him a small, approving nod. "Say his name softly when you approach him, not as a suspect, as William." Barton understood. He left through the garden gate, and his footsteps faded down the lane. Selby remained a moment longer, then turned toward home, letter still in his wife's hand. He did not yet know what words they would say to each other, but something in his step suggested he would try to say them honestly, for the first time in some time. Miss Marple stayed in the rose garden alone. She walked to the place where the arch had once stood. The earth was still dark where the roots had torn, and scattered petals lay like soft confessions on the ground. She knelt slowly, her joints protesting only a little, and then picked up one fallen bloom, its red deepened by dew. So many crimes rooted in love, she thought, and so much love rooted in fear. She closed her eyes. Behind her eyelids, she could almost see the two boys years ago, Arthur laughing too loud, William quiet but radiant in admiration. They would sit beneath the arch, sunlight filtering through petals like stained glass, the world small and safe. Memory has its own architecture, she reflected, and when that architecture collapses, people do desperate things to rebuild what cannot be rebuilt. Footsteps approached behind her, soft, deliberate. It was Mrs. Hardwick carrying a tray with tea. But when she saw Miss Marple kneeling, she stopped and set the tray down carefully on a bench. She stood beside her, looking not at her roses, nor at the ruin of the arch, but at the empty, quiet space that now held its absence. "I loved that boy," she said simply. "I know," Miss Marple answered. "I still do." "Yes," Miss Marple replied, "and that will not change." The two women stood in silence together, the garden breathing around them. After a time, Miss Marple spoke, her voice low and steady. "When William is found, he will need someone who still sees him as he was, not only as what he has done." Mrs. Hardwick nodded slowly, tears finally gathering at her lashes, but not falling. "I will." Miss Marple gave her a gentle, almost imperceptible smile. And that, she said softly, is why the garden can grow again. The village would carry the story for years, softly at first, then stitched into memory, then finally spoken only in quiet winter evenings. But beneath that, life would move on. Roses would bloom again, though perhaps in a slightly different shape. And Miss Marple, calm as ever, would sit in her cottage window with her knitting, watching, listening, and understanding, as she always had. Although the village would one day tell the story, as if it ended there in the rose garden, life does not tie its endings so neatly. The next day arrived, gray, still and expectant, a quiet that felt almost like the moment before a church hymn begins. Miss Marple rose early and walked into her own garden, trimming back a foxglove leaning too eagerly over the path. Her movements were gentle, precise. Grief and guilt had their place in the world, but so did the steady act of tending things. By mid-morning, a knock sounded at her door. It was Lieutenant Barton. The damp on his coat suggested he had walked a long way in the rain. "He's safe," Barton said before she had even offered tea. "William, I found him by the old bridge road before the station. He was sitting on the wall, watching the water. He didn't try to run. He knew someone would come for him." Miss Marple nodded, though she had known this already. "And how did he seem?" "Very tired," Barton answered. Not angry, not scared, just tired, like he understood that the thing he had done had already begun to undo him. He paused. He asked if Mrs. Hardwicke would forgive him. Miss Marple's expression softened. "And what did you say?" "That forgiveness is not something you receive," Barton replied quietly. "It's something someone chooses to give." Miss Marple allowed herself a small, approving smile. "A wise answer." He hesitated, then added, "He didn't ask about prison or punishment." "No," Miss Marple said. "He has already entered his punishment, Lieutenant. Some prisons do not require bars." Barton sat down heavily, as though the truth of that had weight. Miss Marple poured tea for him without asking. He took it gratefully. After a long moment, he asked, "Will the village understand?" "Oh, certainly not," Miss Marple said gently. "Most of them will decide upon a version of events that suits their comfort. Some will pity him, some will condemn him, some will find ways to make the story about themselves." Her voice remained soft, never bitter. "But a few, just a few, will remember that he was a child once, and that sorrow grows unevenly in children." Barton nodded. He seemed to be learning something deeper than detective work, something more akin to seeing. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple went to Mrs. Hardwicke's cottage. The door was open, though the house was quiet. Mrs. Hardwicke sat at her small table, a shawl around her shoulders, eyes turned toward the window where the garden lay outside. Its ruined arch, its fallen petals, its stubborn living roots. When she saw Miss Marple, she did not rise, but she did reach for her hand. "Has he?" "He is safe," Miss Marple said. "He will be brought before the magistrate. They will consider his age, his intent, his circumstances." Mrs. Hardwicke closed her eyes. Not relief, not despair, just something deep and aching settling into place. "Do you believe," she asked softly, "that good can come after something like this?" Miss Marple looked out at the garden. The climbing rose, though cut, was not dead. New growth had already begun along the lower stems, small, steady, quietly determined. "Yes," Miss Marple said, "but not quickly, and not in the way we expect. Good rarely grows from forgetting, only from understanding." Mrs. Hardwicke let out a slow breath. "Then I will wait, and I will understand." Miss Marple squeezed her hand gently. They sat together for a long time, in the quiet, in the light that softened as afternoon lowered toward evening. No one spoke. There was no need. Some healing does not happen in words. Outside, a sparrow landed on the stump of the arch. It tilted its head, chirped once, and flew on. Life continued. It always did. But the village of St. Mildred's would remember this summer, this death among roses, this sorrow rooted deep. And in their remembering, something subtle would shift. They would become gentler, perhaps, or more cautious, or simply more aware that hearts, even quiet ones, can break in ways that make the world tremble. And Miss Marple, knitting now in the quiet of her sitting room, reflected, as she always did, that understanding human nature was both the simplest and most complicated thing in the world. For in every heart there are gardens, some tended, some overgrown, and some with roses that bloom too beautifully to be entirely gentle.